Good day to everyone joining us, and welcome to today's X Talks webinar. Today's talk is entitled Clinical Trials for and Despite COVID-19. My name is Sonia Hunt, and it's my pleasure to be your X Talks moderator for today. Today's webinar will run for approximately 60 minutes. This presentation includes a Q&A session with our speaker. This webinar is designed to be interactive, and webinars work best when you're involved. So please feel free to submit questions and comments for our speakers throughout the presentation by using the questions chat box, and we'll try to attend to your questions during the Q&A session. Now, this chat box is located in the control panel, and that's found on the right-hand side of your screen. If you require assistance, please contact me at any time by sending me a message using that chat panel. At this time, all participants are in listen-only mode. Please note that this event will be recorded and made available to you for future streaming on xtalks.com. At this point, I'd like to thank International Drug Development Institute, IDDI, who developed the content for this presentation. IDDI is an expert center in biostatistical and integrated e-clinical services for pharmaceutical and biotechnology companies in several disease areas, including oncology and ophthalmology. IDDI optimizes the clinical development of drugs, biologics, and devices thanks to proven statistical expertise and operational excellence. Founded in 1991, IDDI has offices in Belgium, Boston, Raleigh, and San Francisco. Now it is my pleasure to introduce you to your speakers for today's event. And first, I'd like to introduce you to Mark Boyes, Chief Scientific Officer at the International Drug Development Institute, IDDI. Mark is the founder of IDDI and of CluePoints, two biostatistical service organizations based in the US and Europe. Mark holds a Doctor of Science in Biostatistics from the Harvard School of Public Health in Boston, Massachusetts. Now it's my pleasure to introduce you to your second speaker, and that is Dr. Everardo Sad, Medical Director at IDDI. Everardo has 20 years of experience in medical oncology and clinical trial designs. He graduated in medicine and trained in internal medicine at Sao Paulo and did his fellowship in medical oncology at the University of Texas MD Anderson Cancer Center in Houston. And now it is my pleasure to pass over the controls and the mic to our first speaker, and that is Everardo. So Everardo, when you're ready, you may begin.
Thank you, Sonia, and thanks everyone for joining this webinar. So today, Mark and I will speak about clinical trials for and despite COVID-19. But in our presentation, we're reversing the order with regard to the title, and I'm going to talk first about clinical trials despite COVID-19, and then Mark will say he will present his part about trials for COVID-19. I will briefly show some of the impact of this pandemic on just a few selected disease areas, and I will highlight some logistic and methodological problems and some suggestions for remedial actions. Then I'll present you with a quiz just for us to have an idea about what our audience thinks about two topics. And then I'll hand it over to Mark, who'll say a few words about clinical trials for COVID-19 with a focus on lessons learned so far and things that we have to keep in mind going forward. So first, let me show you a few things about oncology, which is my specialty. So there is already some evidence that cancer patients are at higher risk for infections by this coronavirus, and also when they get infected to have complications and death due to the virus. And it's felt that anti-cancer treatment may aggravate those risks, especially chemotherapy. People are very cautious also about immunotherapy, although it's not as clear what the effect is, but there is some perception that it's also dangerous to treat patients who might be infected, and apparently there is less risk with targeted therapy, but this is not so well documented. So like in many other disease areas, the pandemic is limiting patient access to treatment centers and the ability of healthcare providers to deliver care. And this leads to delayed diagnosis, treatment, and assessments, which may impact clinical practice and clinical trials, and then also creates the need to set priorities, both in clinical practice and in clinical trials. In clinical practice, for example, one could think of different, let's say, level of priorities from lower to higher, different situations where physicians might need to consider whether or not to treat patients depending on where they are in their disease trajectory. So just to show two extreme examples here, there may be patients receiving palliative treatment in situations for which there is no demonstrated benefit in major endpoints or even doubt about symptom control. So this would be low priority and of course high priority situations where patients with acute leukemias or aggressive lymphomas or testicular cancer might need urgent treatment that is life-saving. So these are two extreme situations where the pros and cons of treating versus withholding therapy in these times need to be weighed. Now, in cardiology, there is also considerable documentation about certain diseases, especially heart failure. But it seems that patients with cardiovascular disease also have a higher incidence and severity of this infection. Patients specifically with heart failure hospitalized are at higher risk for death if they have COVID-19 in addition to the heart failure. COVID-19 is thought to increase the risk and severity of other cardiovascular conditions such as venous thromboembolism and arrhythmias. And interesting, in many studies, people have documented a decreased incidence of visits to emergency departments for coronary syndromes and also other indications. It's not very clear yet if this is a true phenomenon or if it has to do with people not seeking care or whether people who are otherwise suffering from these conditions have been affected by the pandemic. It's not very clear yet. So there is a reverse, let's say, impact in certain very specific conditions. Likewise, in neurology, people have documented a decreased frequency of emergency visits for strokes and for other neurological conditions, whereas conversely, there seems to be an increased incidence of stroke among patients who have COVID-19, and patients with stroke and also with COVID-19 seem to be at higher risk for disability and death than those without COVID-19. So this was just a little introduction about three disease areas. Let's see some of the logistic and administrative impact on ongoing trials, those that were already ongoing when the pandemic started. So there are several things that you may consider that are being affected, such as access of patients to treatment centers because of travel restrictions, because of regulations imposing certain restrictions, or even because patients are infected or have fear of becoming infected. Staff itself can have limited access due to regulations or to the infection itself. Some sites may be closed. There may be disruption of the supply chain for medications. As a result of these things, there will be missed visits, missed treatments, missed assessments, whether for clinical trials or for clinical practice. Obviously, we can expect protocol deviations extended timelines for completion of certain studies, in some cases even temporary or permanent discontinuation of the study, and a more less tangible, let's say, a consequence is that the scientific community may need to change certain priorities in terms of what kind of research to conduct, where to focus efforts. I just wanted to show this trial as an example of creative solutions during these times and going forward. Although this is a trial for COVID-19, so it would belong in Mark's part of the presentation, I'm showing it here for the sake of the methodology used, which is quite ingenious. So in this study of one of the studies of hydroxychloroquine, in this case for post-exposure prophylaxis, comparing hydroxychloroquine with placebo, investigators recruited patients primarily through social media as well as other conventional media platforms. The participants enrolled themselves using an internet application. They would sign the consent form using the same platform. Randomization was done at research pharmacies, and then the medication would be shipped to patients overnight to participants, and even the outcomes were ascertained through emails, text messages, and telephone calls in a manner that patients would inform if they had PCR results, symptoms, and or hospitalizations, and of course they tried to find out about people who eventually died. And so this was done. This was possible in this study, I guess, with very little risk of bias because it was placebo controlled. So it's not the case that all these things are always possible, but that's a nice example of ingenuity, let's say, in terms of conducting trials, and hopefully a lot of these methods can be used going forward in other indications as well. So in this review paper, focusing mostly on heart failure, the authors have put together some of the things that I've been mentioning in terms of the impact of COVID-19 on ongoing clinical trials. In this case, it's heart failure, but many of the points discussed in this paper are useful in different situations. So we don't need to go into the details of every single problems that they point out, but basically they divide problems or issues into those affecting patients and staff, and problems and issues affecting data quality and the preservation of scientific integrity of the study. So in terms of remedial actions for issues affecting patients and staff, they talk about, for example, about using virtual visits, broadly called telemedicine, if you will, so converting physical or face-to-face visits into virtual visits. Try to use as much remote monitoring of patients as possible, again, as part of telemedicine initiatives, shipping or mailing the investigational product like we saw in the previous example, home visits whenever possible, and even segregating the trial staff into different shifts or teams that do not interact, thus minimizing the risk of contamination and infection. And in terms of issues affecting data quality or the trial integrity, to prioritize collection of data that are really critical to assessing or to addressing the primary and key secondary endpoints in the study. They suggest that we list all patients affected by the infection, that we provide for easy ways for investigators to document that the failure of data in terms of data collection or missingness is due to COVID-19, for example, by have automated options for this infection, document all reasons for protocol deviation, making clear when it is related to COVID-19 or not, and other things that might make it possible to differentiate at the time of analysis the data that were collected before COVID-19 and after COVID-19, because in many cases there will be a need for sensitivity analysis or exploratory analysis in that regard to try to assess the impact of the pandemic on the trial. Now, the group at Dana-Farber Cancer Institute and Brigham Health has reported their experience. It's a very nice paper. I just got here 2 pieces of information from that paper, reporting their experience in terms of clinical trials during the first 6 months of 2020, comparing with the previous year. And it's clear that there was a very significant decrease in terms of numbers of patients enrolled in their therapeutic trials. Here it's only therapeutic trials. They have decided to put on hold many other studies which were not strictly therapeutic, such as observational studies or other types of investigations. So this is one example of the impact in terms of patient numbers. And here they show us how they tackled the issue of patient visits. So during 2020, there was a sharp decrease in face-to-face visits, shown here in blue bars, and at the same time an increase in virtual visits, and then probably related to phases of confinement and deconfinement in Massachusetts. There was again a replacement by virtual visits, replacement of these virtual visits by face-to-face visits at certain points. So this is only until a certain month, I think June or early July. So the situation may have changed ever since. Now, I'm not a statistician, and I'm not planning to cover statistical issues in great detail, and Mark will address some of those issues, although again not in great detail. But I just wanted to point out some that have been discussed very extensively in recent papers and webinars, and so this has become, let's say, the issues that are being highlighted by the current situation. Obviously, there are problems with bias, power, and our ability to interpret study results, and these may come from reduced accrual because of the reasons we've already pointed out. There may be a change in the population being enrolled because of the pandemic, so a different patient profile perhaps will be accrued during the pandemic in a given trial for other indications. There may be issue with compliance with treatment and visits and everything, resulting in missing data. Of course, this is the greatest threat to clinical trials. There will be underreporting, for example, of adverse events. So it's important to compare previous before and after the pandemic, for example, to have an idea about the occurrence of this underreporting. There will be competing risks related to the infection. For example, the risk of death is an obvious one, and there may be an impact on the IDMC or DSMB activities because of the restrictions imposed by the pandemic. Well, the question always is there a differential effect of the pandemic on trial arms? Yes or no, and whether there is also a differential impact on countries and regions because they may be affected differentially by the pandemic. Now, some things to consider, and I'm making reference a few times to this paper, which Mark will highlight at the end. Many of the discussions come from there. So some of the great topics to be addressed is how to assess and mitigate risks, for example, related to data missingness. We should expect as a general rule that there will be no differential impact on trial arms. So as a general rule, intent to treat analysis will continue to be used because we don't expect that in most situations different arms of the trials will be affected differently. So in many cases, for example, data might be missing completely at random or at random, although this has to be considered on a case-by-case basis because there may be rare situations where this is not the case. Another large topic is what to do in terms of protocols and statistical analysis plans. In some situations, it may be necessary to consider sample size increases due to decreased accrual, treatment dilution, loss of data leading to, let's say, reduced power. Um, um, like I said, the intent to treat analysis should, as much as possible, continue to prevail. And one thing that is being repeatedly discussed related to the pandemic is the new estimates framework, which is really a very interesting let's say, playground for testing all these new ideas about estimates, and this is leading to lots of discussions and changes. Mark and I will not going to talk about this today because IDDI is organizing a webinar, I believe in December, specifically about the topics of estimates, so we'll not cover that in great detail today. Now, it's very important to have an ongoing assessment of risks that may threaten the validity of individual studies, and this has been emphasized by lots of investigators as well as regulatory agencies. So in terms of the regulatory agencies, both FDA and EMA have put forth documents in the form of guidance for investigators during these times. And general recommendations by these bodies include always to prioritize the safety of patients and personnel, to take a proactive approach to risks, both in terms of identifying and mitigating risks, to seek regulatory advice whenever needed, to document changes in procedures, and to communicate openly with patients and investigators and all the actors, let's say, in the clinical trials setting. Just quick notes that I made about the FDA guidance, which is obviously very rich in information. These are just some things that I found relevant. For example, to make sure the CRF is changed to capture COVID-19 specific information. They suggest that product accountability be maintained because the supply chain may be disrupted, the mode of delivery may change, but sponsors and investigators have to ensure this can be tracked. Like I said, consult with the agency for changes that affect data management or the statistical analysis plan. Address potential protocol deviations, obviously in the SAP before database lock. One very interesting suggestion is to optimize the use of whatever means of remote monitoring can be done. For example, central statistical monitoring is recommended. And then to describe in the clinical study report or perhaps in a separate document, depending on what the sponsor wants to do, things related to the pandemic, such as measures implemented, how participating sites were affected, and the analysis that were conducted to address the impact of those of the measures that were implemented during the study. And then by EMA, there are two documents listed here. Some things that I got from there, for example, to assess not only the feasibility, but also the need for starting new trials at this time, of course, because they will likely be compromised to a certain extent. So really prioritize which trials should be done, which should be postponed perhaps, ensure that existing systems can record all the protocol deviations and reasons related to the pandemic, and if not already in place, to establish an IDMC, and if it's in place, consider the need to revise its charter. So this is what I wanted to say about trials despite COVID-19, and now I'm going to present to you our first poll question. So I'll read the question and then hand it over to Sonia, who will put up the options for you to vote, and we hope you guys will find this useful and entertaining. So the first question is, suppose there is a double-blind trial of a new drug versus placebo in patients with a cardiovascular condition. And in this trial, one of the assessments for efficacy is the 6-minute walk test. And so this is a test whereby the patient will walk for 6 minutes and register how the healthcare provider will register how much they were able to walk, and this is a measure of function, let's say. And so due to the pandemic, patient visits to the hospital are now compromised. Should the conduct of the trial be modified, and how? And that's where I will ask Sonia to help me with the poll.
Yes, thank you very much, Everardo. I'm now going to launch the poll question. Now, audience members, this is done in real time, so your participation is very much encouraged and welcomed. So please go ahead and cast your vote. And the question again is a 6-minute walk test in a double-blind trial of a new drug versus placebo in cardiovascular disease. So please select one of the below. We have continued the trial unchanged to the extent possible, or replace the 6-minute walk test by a similar test at home, or the final option is stop the trial because results will be unreliable. So please go ahead and cast your vote. I'll give another 10 seconds for those of you who have not cast your vote. Please go ahead and do so. But it does look like we have the majority of our members have done that. So thank you very much for that. And let me give another 10 seconds for those of you who have not done so, if you could do so now. And then I will close the polls and share the results. Okay, thank you everyone for participating in that last poll question. I'm now going to close the polls and share the results. Okay, so here are the results of that first poll question. The question again was 6-minute walk test in a double-blind trial of a new drug versus placebo in cardiovascular disease. And the results are these here. 16% continue the trial unchanged to the extent possible. We have 77% at replace the 6-minute walk test by a similar test at home, and 7% for stop the trial because the results will be unreliable. So thank you everyone for participating in that poll question. Now back to Everardo. And Everardo, what do you think about the results?
Well, thanks, Sonia. Yeah, interesting because they pretty much reflect our views. So probably stopping the trial would be overreacting, although some people may have to, given different circumstances. But we don't think this, as a general rule, the reasons presented here would not be sufficient to stop the trial. The results may still be reliable to a certain extent, at least because there is placebo control, but and it's double blind, of course. So this probably is not the best option. The trial can continue unchanged to the extent possible. That's always an option and sometimes a necessity. But it's pretty. We consider it pretty reasonable to, in whenever feasible, to replace assessments by something that can be done at a distance. For example, patients can try to measure how much they can walk in 6 minutes. And since this is double blind, we believe that this would be probably the best option given the three that we presented here. So the second question is this one. An open label trial of a new drug versus standard of care in patients with advanced colorectal cancer required a CT scan every 8 weeks as part of the efficacy assessment. And again, due to COVID-19, patients cannot come to the hospital. And so should the analysis of the trial be modified, and how? So again, Sonia, please help me with the poll.
Not a problem. Thank you very much, Everardo. And here I'm going to launch the poll, and you'll see it in front of you, and there it is. And the question we have for you, as Everardo said, but this is a shortened version of it, CT scans every 8 weeks in an open label trial of a new drug versus standard of care in colorectal cancer. So please select one of the below. We have censor patients after their last scheduled CT scan, exclude patients who did not attend all CT scans, and the final option, use all available CT scans without censoring. Okay, and just like we did before, this will be done in real time. And it looks like we have the majority of our audience members have cast their votes. So thank you very much for those of you who have done so. And for those of you who have not, can you please go ahead and do so right now? I'll give you another 10 seconds, and then I will close the polls and share the results with everyone. Okay, thank you everyone for doing that for me and for us here for this webinar. We're going to close the polls now and share the results. Okay, so here are the results of that last poll question. And the question again was CT scans every 8 weeks in an open label trial of a new drug versus standard of care in colorectal cancer. Okay, and the results are here. 37% at censor patients after the last scheduled CT scan, 1% at exclude patients who did not attend all CT scan, and the last one is 61% use all available CT scans without censoring. So thank you very much for that. And now I'm going to pass over the controls to our second speaker, and that is Mark. So Mark, when you are ready, you may begin. And Mark, tell me, what do you think about the results of that last poll question?
Thank you, Sonia. So Mark Boyce here. I'm going to take over from Everardo from now on and comment on the results of the poll here. About 1/3 of the participants chose option 1, and about 2/3 chose option 3. Only one, I think, 1% chose the second option, which was to exclude patients. And this, in a sense, reflects what we were expecting to see. Our own preference would be to use all available data, all available CT scans in this case, without censoring. And in general, this is our preferred option, is to just consider all the data that have been collected and to not censor patients arbitrarily for any reason. Now, I think 1/3 of you chose to censor patients after their last scheduled CT scan because this is the option that FDA would typically recommend, at least in normal times. First of all, we are no longer in normal times. People will miss their scans just, for good reasons, because COVID-19 prevents them from going to the hospital and having their CT scans on time. So I think this idea of censoring patients because they didn't come to the visit on time just doesn't apply in these very special times. And I would even argue, and this is a personal view, that even in normal times, why should you penalize someone from not going to the visit? A patient could actually feel bad and not go to the CT scan as required. Why would you censor that patient? Why would you not consider the next CT scan of that patient as just as informative as the one that they missed? So I think, one sometimes needs to object against rules that are imposed by agencies if they don't make sense. And this is one rule that, in my view, doesn't make sense. Anyway, I think this was an interesting question, and it leads me to my topic, which is clinical trials for COVID-19. And I think the reason that this is an important topic, in my view, is mostly to discuss the methodology of these trials and the fact that these trials wonderfully illustrate the need for doing trials that have speed, pragmatism, efficiency, flexibility, and cost effectiveness, all of which obviously applies to trials in other indications. But I think the COVID-19 offers us, in a sense, a real life example of how this can be done and why we should do it, not just in COVID-19, but in other indications as well. And Everardo already pointed to that possibility in his talk. So how many trials are we talking about trials in COVID-19? It's kind of hard to know exactly how many, but these slides will give you an idea of how many we're talking about. At the end of May 2020, which was the first wave of the epidemic, I could find 470 trials in clinicaltrials.gov, and this is recruiting studies, so active studies for an intervention. So essentially treatment studies, therapeutic studies, so that this does not include, case control studies and other types of investigations, just clinical trials that are open to entry for a treatment comparison. So 470 at the end of May, and if we update this today, end of October, we now have more than double that number. So again, clinicaltrials.gov, more than 1,000 studies for COVID-19 patients. And so the search, you can do the search yourself. You just ask for recruiting studies, interventional studies, and the keyword COVID-19, and it will give you all the studies that are relevant. Now, this may be an underestimate, obviously, of the total number of trials, if only because clinicaltrials.gov does not contain all the ongoing trials. Some trials are done in other countries than the US, and most of these trials are not registered, unfortunately, in clinicaltrials.gov, but they can be found in other databases. One interesting database that I recently discovered is sponsored by the Anti-Cancer Fund, and it's a database called REDO, and that stands for Repurposing Drugs in Oncology. So that database is primarily aimed at finding all the clinical studies that look at repurposed drugs. And obviously, one big reason to repurpose drug is for cancer treatment, but here drugs have been repurposed also for COVID-19 treatment. In this database at the end of October, there were 1,618 trials, so substantially more than in clinicaltrials.gov. And if you look at the statistics here, they show some interesting figures. About 2/3 of these clinical trials actually concerned repurposed drugs, and about 1/3 then concerned new drugs. There were some vaccination and prevention trials, but the majority were treatment trials. And if you look at the numbers of patients or subjects that were planned to be enrolled in these trials, it's a fairly substantial number, 1 million participants. I guess that some of the vaccine trials have very large numbers of subjects, but even in the treatment trials, the number of patients potentially included in randomized trials is really, or at least in interventional trials, is very substantial indeed. And here are the names of a few drugs that have been included in these trials. I'll come back to that in a second. And finally, there is an interesting database maintained by the WHO, the World Health Organization, and that database shows 2,650 trials at this time. And again, they provide the details of all these trials. So we're talking about large numbers of trials here and very large numbers of patients potentially included in these trials. Like I said, 2/3 of these trials concern repurposed drugs, mostly antiretroviral drugs that were developed for other indication or under other viruses, Ebola virus, HIV, the flu, and also some specifically for COVID-19, new drugs. And then, of course, there are some drugs that have been repurposed from other diseases, hydroxychloroquine, the now infamous drug that was developed for malaria initially, drugs for multiple sclerosis, arthritis, or hypertension, and then finally non-drug treatments, in particular convalescent plasma, which is the topic of many randomized trials at this time. So I think what all these trials showed, obviously because of the epidemic and the severity of the epidemic, was the need for speed. And this is really, in my view, a remarkable achievement that these trials were set up in record time. If it takes like 6 months to plan and develop the protocol and get a trial going, at least 6 months, you just couldn't do it in 6 months for COVID. You had to do it in 6 days. And so the order of magnitude has changed. I mean, what used to take 6 months now takes 6 days. And it's really remarkable that the protocols that were put in place very rapidly with almost instantaneous ethical approval, which is also completely different from what we used to know. Many experts contributed voluntarily and freely, of course, just because of the necessity to do so. And there was, in many cases, a wide collaboration that was put in place very rapidly and very easily between the private sector, the public sector, and academia. And this is really remarkable. Likewise, many companies provided drugs for these trials with a speed that was unheard before. And in terms of the trial conduct, many of these trials were implemented in a no-nonsense fashion, collecting only essential data, using obviously electronic data capture, simple systems to capture the data, using central statistical monitoring or some such software instead of sending people to the sites, and then using common resources for shared information between the different DSMBs of all these trials. And this is really remarkable, and I think we will probably reuse some of these features in trials in all other indications after the COVID-19. And I think it's fair to say that the need for pragmatism became obvious and became almost like a necessity that was beyond discussion during the COVID-19 epidemic. And here I've just summarized a table that many of you have seen in some form or another, the distinction between a so-called explanatory trial, typically a trial used for registration by drug companies, versus a pragmatic trial, typically an investigator-led trial that has some public health impact and that is not aimed for registration. And I think this is important it's an important table because it sort of shows the characteristics of both of these trial types. Each of them has their own characteristics, and we need to be aware that these characteristics are very different indeed. Patient selection, a drug company would typically aim at the fittest patients, not to have safety issues with a new drug, and it does make some sense to do that, obviously, whereas in a pragmatic public health trial, you want to enter all patients because after all, you know that intervention will be given in all patients. The effect of interest is the ideal treatment effect in an explanatory trial, the best effect of the drug possible, whereas in the real world, it's the actual effect of the drug as given in the real world. Endpoint assessment can be centrally reviewed and often is centrally reviewed by a committee of experts or some central review of the imaging, for example, whereas in a pragmatic trial, it's done by the local investigator. The preferred control is obviously an untreated arm for a new drug. It's obviously the standard of care, which whatever it may be, could be another drug, could be something that hasn't been shown to be effective in a pragmatic trial. Conditions are strictly controlled in an explanatory trial, just clinical routine conditions for a pragmatic trial. Data collected, extensive data are collected for registration because you want to document anything that could happen with a new drug, including any safety issues. In a pragmatic trial, you want to collect only key data, only big safety problems that were not expected, and also the endpoints of interest. And finally, for quality control, there is extensive and on-site control of the quality of the data in an explanatory trial, and there is very limited and centrally reviewed quality in a pragmatic trial. So all of these differences have a big impact on how the trial gets conducted. And it's fair to say that the trials are conducted in a very different way and with a very different budget. I will come back to the question of budget after I show a few examples. A first example, I'm sure all of you have seen this trial. It's a remarkable trial run in the United Kingdom and coordinated out of Oxford University, the recovery trial. And recovery stands for randomized evaluation of COVID-19 therapy. This report was published in the New England Journal a few months ago, and this trial compared dexamethasone with corresponding with nothing, in fact, with no treatment, with standard of care in hospitalized patients with COVID-19. And what this trial showed was a remarkable a difference in mortality, a remarkable reduction of mortality. You might say, well, this is a small reduction, but it's a very worthwhile one. If you think of it, it's a 17% reduction in mortality, which is far from negligible if you compare the usual care to dexamethasone. And by the way, this was done in a large number of patients. 4,300 received usual care and 2,100 received dexamethasone. All of this was done in a matter of 3 months. It's almost unbelievable that they were able in the UK to carry out such an amazing large-scale trial. And the trial not only showed the benefit of dexamethasone, which is a very simple treatment to give, but it also suggested that some patients might need it more than others. Patients who are on mechanical ventilation probably require dexamethasone much more than patients who simply receive some oxygen. And patients who do not receive oxygen may actually not benefit from dexamethasone. This is a trend. It's not completely reliably established yet, but it's a strong trend and probably a very impressive and convincing one. Another trial that falls in the same area as the recovery trial is the WHO Solidarity trial. And again, this trial was a very pragmatic trial where patients were randomized between any drug that was available at a center and the corresponding control. So in other words, giving that drug versus not giving that drug. And this is a very pragmatic trial because it looks at any combination of these drugs. So different centers may have different drugs available at the time they randomize a patient, and the patients will just be randomized properly to whatever treatment is available in that center at that time. So the trial ended up having about 2,700 remdesivir treated patients versus control, about 950 hydroxychloroquine versus control, about 1,400 lopinavir versus control, and about 2,000 interferon versus control. And again, this trial was pragmatically done. It looked at mortality. And in contrast with the recovery trial, this trial showed no benefit on remdesivir. Despite all the noise that was made around remdesivir, it doesn't work to reduce mortality in patients who are hospitalized. Hydroxychloroquine obviously doesn't work. We now know this from not only this trial, but other trials as well. It actually doesn't do anything. Lopinavir doesn't do anything, and interferon doesn't do anything. Actually, the trend here is even reversed. So none of these drugs actually works in patients who are hospitalized. Now, these trials are fine, pragmatic trials. They look at very broad questions, but sometimes you can do better than just randomizing patients between anything that's available and control. You can, for example, carry out a factorial design, like was done in this trial. This trial is actually ongoing in Belgium, and it's a very efficient design because patients are randomized twice. They are randomized in a factorial fashion between Kineret and anakinra and usual care, and separately from that, between siltuximab and tocilizumab and usual care. So the idea of this trial is to look at IL-1 and IL-6 blockade as two interventions that might actually help reduce the cytokine storm that has been shown to be so detrimental to patients who are hospitalized. So before the storm actually occurs, this is a preventive this is a preventive intervention for the storm. And so the good feature about this trial is that it looks at several questions with a limited number of patients. It looks at the effect of all of these drugs separately. It also looks at the potential interaction between these drugs. It may well be that total blockade might be better than partial blockade of only IL-6 or IL-1. If you look at the two combined, you can look at the interaction. And the other thing that's very attractive for the clinicians who partake to this trial is that out of 9 patients randomized, only 2 of these 9 will actually receive the usual care, which we know not to be very effective in these patients. And then all the rest of them, 7 out of 9, will receive some form of treatment. So this trial is hugely attractive to clinicians and patients. Another need that I think we've seen with COVID-19 is the need for flexibility. And a very nice trial design, again from the UK, is the Principal trial, the platform randomized trials of interventions against COVID-19 in older people. So this is a trial that targets patients who have been exposed to COVID and have symptoms, but who are not yet hospitalized. And the idea of the trial is to actually try to reduce hospital admissions and improve symptoms for these patients. So this is a very simple kind of questionnaire that patients can look at if they want to be randomized, and then they can be randomized in the trial. And the trial, the reason I mentioned this trial is that it's a flexible design. It's a so-called platform trial. And if you're interested in platform trials, I highly recommend this paper by Janet Woodcock and Lisa Lavange. Both were very active at the FDA, and Janet Woodcock still is. And this paper describes the sort of master protocols that we can now use, not just for COVID-19, but for any disease. And we can actually use them in different ways. But the platform trial has a very interesting feature because it's a kind of flexible trial that can evolve over time. So this is a general graph that shows the idea of a platform trial. You start a trial with several groups of patients, may be defined by a biomarker or by any other stratification factor. You randomize them between a standard of care at that time and investigational new drugs, and then things can change over time. In fact, a new drug might become available, and then you randomize patients to it. Some drugs may have to be stopped. Some standards of care may have to be changed. You know, when an investigational new drug is shown effective, that becomes the standard. And so all of these features are very flexible and allow the trial to evolve over time. And this is probably something that will be very effective for COVID, but also for cancer treatment and probably some other treatments as well. Finally, I think we need to be more cost effective. It's fair to say that the cost of clinical research has become absurdly high. It's evaluated that for an explanatory trial, for an industry-sponsored registration trial, the cost per patient is anywhere between $10,000 and $100,000 or euros per patient. What we want is actually to drive that cost down to less than 1,000 euros per patient. Can that be done? Well, that remains to be seen. But again, I think the COVID-19 precedent will be very helpful going forward. Interesting data here from a paper on the cost of pivotal trials, so trials for approval in different therapeutic areas. The average cost of a registration trial in cardiovascular disease is $150 million per trial. It's about $45 million in cancer, and it's around about $20,000 to $30,000 in other indications. Now, these costs are huge. No one can afford these costs anymore, except very large pharmaceutical companies. And even they sometimes bark at the idea of spitting out so much money, given that they are not guaranteed to have their returns on investment. And this again comes from a paper I would highly recommend by Rory Collins and colleagues, who showed that in the last decade, the 10 top selling drugs had a revenue that increased more than twofold. However, the number of patients that took these drugs decreased almost tenfold. So we increased the cost of drugs and we reduced the number of, or we decreased the number of patients who can actually have access to these drugs or who have indications that these drugs target. That is not right. There is something wrong in the system here. Likewise, if we look at the CRO, the Contract Research Organization revenues in the last decades, they have increased 20-fold. However, the number of new drug approvals did not increase in the last 30 or 40 years. As we know, if we look at the number of new drugs approved by MHRA in the UK, it remained pretty much flat with a little bit of an increase, but pretty much flat over the last 40 years. And likewise, if we look at the number of new drugs approved by FDA, it remains pretty flat. So why is it that the costs have increased 20-fold for a number of drugs that hasn't increased very much at all? So I think we have a problem here, and COVID-19 has taught us that, if anything, randomized clinical trials are irreplaceable. The whole story of hydroxychloroquine and all the patients who were treated with a drug outside of trials shows how absurd it is to claim that a drug has benefit if you haven't shown it in a randomized clinical trial. And again, this paper by Rory Collins and colleagues really makes the point very clear that there is something magical about randomization. It just settles the issue. If you don't know if a drug works or to what extent it works, I think the randomized clinical trial is the only evidence that will definitely establish that it does work. And so we need randomized trials. We will continue to need randomized trials, but perhaps even more than ever, we will need them. But clinical trials are very vulnerable, and the COVID crisis has shown this. Protocol requirements in many trials are overly rigid. They just do not sustain the impact of a COVID-19 epidemic or any other type of disruption. The protocols are too rigid. The endpoints require access to specialized resources, as we've seen with the 6-minute walk test. What if the patient cannot go to the hospital? The whole trial is jeopardized. So we should have other measures of efficacy that can be taken easily, pragmatically, and at low cost. The number of patients is usually too small because the cost per patient is so high. People try to reduce the number of patients instead of reducing the cost of a patient. Clinical trials also do not reflect clinical practice. This is a huge problem because selection criteria are so narrow that the trial is positive, but no one believes in the results because the results are taken in a very special population, and therefore the results may be jeopardized when the treatment is given in the wild real world. And finally, the result, randomized clinical trials are just not sustainable. Even from a cost perspective, they are not sustainable. They are inflexible, inefficient. Very many processes in clinical trials are useless, like source data verification and all that thing. It's just useless. People should stop doing this. It adds no value to the results of a trial, and the cost is prohibitive. So to finish, let me just show you a paper that was mentioned a few times during our talk. It's a paper that just appeared in Contemporary Clinical Trials. And with that, I think we needed 5 minutes for questions, and I'm just right on time. We have a few minutes for questions. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you very much, Mark, for that very detailed presentation. I hope everyone enjoyed it. So let me just begin with the Q&A portion of the webinar. I'll take back control of the screen. And then I want to just remind the audience members that you can continue sending in your questions or comments right now using the questions window for the Q&A portion of the webinar. I've already received some questions, so I will start with those. And just looking at the time, I think we'll try to squeeze in 2 questions. So gentlemen, here we go. Here's our first question, Mark and Everardo. The first question is, how would you deal with deaths from COVID-19 in a trial in oncology, having survival as the primary endpoint?
Hmm.
That's one for Everardo, our
Possibly.
oncologist.
Let me give it a try. Yes. So yeah, in oncology or any other area where survival would be, let's say, a key endpoint, if not the primary endpoint, obviously we're not interested in deaths from COVID-19. So the first thing is we would hope that these deaths or the infection itself affects both arms with the same likelihood, let's say. So assuming that one could hope that an intent to treat analysis would preserve the integrity of the analysis, I guess. But one could consider some types of sensitivity analysis provided the causes of death are known. For example, maybe doing some kind of competing risks analysis, or maybe just focusing on cancer-specific survival rather than overall survival. So maybe these were some of the possibilities. I don't know if Mark wants to add something more statistical to that.
No, actually, I want to add something clinical, even though I'm not a clinician. You know, as a as a patient, if I'm in a randomized trial, I don't care what I'm going to die of. You know, if I die, it's bad news, and so I don't care if it's due to COVID or cancer. So from that perspective, I mean, this may be the patient perspective. If one, arm does better than the other in terms of mortality, that's all I want to know. And so as a patient, I would insist that the primary analysis be overall mortality by treatment arm, no questions asked, no exclusions, no nothing. Just show me the number of dead bodies by treatment arm, and that is going to be what convinces me as a patient. So I think from a statistical point of view, of course, we could say the exact same thing. We could say the only unbiased analysis is one that includes all death without regard to the cause of death. That being said, I would do what you recommended too, Everardo. I would then do competing risk analyses or even just excluding COVID-19 death and try to assess the sensitivity of the results to these exclusions or to these other types of analyses. But I think the primary analysis should always remain, the good old ITT.
Okay, thank you very much for that, Mark and Everardo. Okay, we're going to squeeze in one more question, and here it is. For an ongoing trial, is the option of changing endpoint as mentioned in the first poll possible from regulatory perspective?
Mark, what do you think?
Well, I think this is going to be, as FDA says, a review issue. When they don't know what to say, they say it's a review issue. I think when it comes to this kind of serious problems we've seen with COVID, you've got to change, and the agencies have to accept, and I think they will accept, that some changes are absolutely required. And I think, as Everardo said, if indeed you change to a sort of home-based test rather than the 6-minute, standardized walk test, it's okay if you do it in both arms equally. And I think the agency will certainly be open to a discussion. I'm not saying they will say yes always, but I think it's worth a discussion with them.
Okay, you know what? Let's see if we could squeeze in this one last question here. Can you give practical suggestions regarding sample size increase in a trial affected by the pandemic?
Oof, boy, that's a good one. Practical suggestion. I think you can consider it. You can do it. I would do it not adaptively. In other words, I would do it based on overall event rate rather than treatment-specific event rates. In other words, I would do a sample size increase simply because I have more events, for example, than I expected, more death, let's say, than I expected, or less death than I expected. Less death would be unlikely, but less events because I haven't been able to measure them. For example, progressive disease in cancer might be affected by the fact that I couldn't measure it always reliably. So I would do it based on the circumstance of each trial, and I would do it, if possible, in a non-adaptive fashion. In other words, without looking at treatment effect. Because if you do it based on the treatment effect, it becomes an adaptive change, and that opens up, a kind of worms. So I think ideally it should be done based on just the totality of the data without treatment comparisons. But there are some cases where a treatment comparison can be considered too, and then it becomes an adaptive change, which has its own difficulties. But I can't really give a recommendation, to be honest. It's a tough question.
Okay, well, thank you very much for trying, and I think that was a very thorough answer. So thank you very much, Mark and Everardo. Well, thank you very much for those questions. We have reached the end of the question and answer portion of the webinar. If we couldn't attend to your questions, the team at International Drug Development Institute, IDDI, may follow up with you after this presentation. Now, if you have any further questions, direct them to the email addresses on your screen, and there it is, to Dominique Grizzard, and she's at iddi.com. Thank you everyone for participating in today's webinar. You will be receiving a follow-up email from Xtalks with access to the recorded archive for this event. A survey window will be popping up on your screen. Your participation is appreciated as it will help us to improve on our further webinars. Now, I'm about to send you a link in your chat box. You'll be able to view the recording of this event at that link and also share this link with your colleagues when they register for the recording as well. So I encourage you to do that. Now, please join us in thanking our speakers, Mark Boyce, Chief Scientific Officer, and Dr. Everardo Sad, Medical Director, both with the International Drug Development Institute, IDDI, for that very insightful presentation. We hope you found this webinar informative. It has been my pleasure to be your webinar moderator. On behalf of the team here at Xtalks, we thank you for joining us. I'm Sonia Hunt. Until next time, please take care and bye for now.